Alright everyone, get ready for a heavy topic, because today we are talking about the terms shamanism and shaman and their extremely awful and problematic history. We will talk about whether you should even use the term shaman or shamanic and what that even means, if it has a definition, if it is clear-cut. But we will definitely go very heavily into the history of these terms, how they were appropriated and used for personal gain, basically all throughout history, and then how it was idolized and again used for personal benefit in another manner. So it's a long history. This will probably be a very long video. I'm sorry in advance if you're not interested in history, then maybe skip to the end of the video. I will have chapters up as always, so feel free to skip, but the history is basically the most important part about this video, so probably don't skip it. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to skip that part. But why do I even make a video like this? This was actually inspired by a book that I read. I was always a little bit careful about the terms shaman and shamanism because I never really read a clear-cut definition of what that is and where that term came from. And then I found this book, which sadly it's only in German and I don't think it has an English translation yet. It is Das Rätsel der Schamanen von Harald, Meller and Michel. This one. If you are able to read German, then get this book. This is amazing. I loved it so much. I think I read it within 2 days because it's just amazing and addictive. If you are unfortunately not able to read German books, then I will definitely put a part of the bibliography of this book in the video description, because a lot of the books are available in English. For example, they quote a lot from Ronald Hutton's books, which are amazing in general. So I will make sure to put resources for anyone who doesn't understand German in the video description. But if you do, read this book. It's amazing and it inspired me to make this video, because I feel like the words or the terms shaman and shamanism are thrown around all the time in any magical space or new age space, and like you hear so many people saying that they are a shaman or a shamanic practitioner, but I have never seen anyone really reflect on what those terms really mean and where they came from. And I think it's extremely interesting, especially if you think about topics like cultural appropriation and oppression of minorities. So that's why I really wanted to make this video. I hope that you will learn something from this video and maybe reflect a little bit on your usage of those words. I feel like sometimes I still use these words, but then I do a shamanic. But yeah, we will get into that. Let's go. As I said, let us first look into the history of the terms shaman and shamanism and in what kind of context these terms were used. The first time that we see the word shaman being printed was actually during the witch hunts as a description of a magical practitioner in Siberia. It was first printed in the memoirs of a Russian priest with a name that I cannot properly pronounce, Avakom Petrov. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but that's a difficult name for me to pronounce. But yeah, that Russian priest wrote down his memoirs, and in 1672 we find the word shaman being used in a written manner for the first time. This Russian priest had been exiled to Siberia, to the Evenki nomads, and these people, this tribe or these tribes, I don't know if it's multiple, they had of course magical practitioners, and they would shaman. It was actually a verb, not a noun. So this Russian priest in his memoirs shortly describes a divinatory rite that was performed by one of these magical practitioners of the Evenki nomads, and he uses the Tungusian verb shaman for that. So it's not a noun, it's actually a verb, and that is where it came from. It was just one of those magical practitioners who did some kind of divinatory rite, and the verb for that process was shaman, to shaman. Later on, between 1693 and 1695, two dudes, one German dude called Adam Brandt and one Dutch dude called Eberhard Isbrand-Ides, traveled through Siberia to China, and of course there they also encountered the Evenki people and their magical practitioners. Of course, these two dudes wrote travel journals as you did back in the days. And of course, they also wrote about the Evenki people and their magical practitioners, their shamans, whom they called magicians / seers / priests. And what's very, very important, these two dudes also wrote that the Evenki people worshipped the devil. So they definitely made the first connection between the Evenki people, shamans, and devil worship. What they also describe in their travel journals is some kind of rite that the shaman or the seer / magician / priest performs, and what garb he wears while doing that. So they describe that this outfit was decorated with bears, lions, snakes, and dragons, and that the shaman plays the drum and sings like the howling of a wolf, and then he afterwards passes out and falls to the ground. So that was kind of some kind of magical action that this magical practitioner performed, and they wrote that down in their travel journal. Those travel journals alone weren't very much influential, but they became very, very important because later on a very, very well-known influential person, a Dutch dude called Nicolaas Witsen, who knew both Brandt and Ides, included their travel journal entries into his own book, which I cannot pronounce. I can't pronounce Dutch. I'm sorry, I will put the name of the book on screen. But yeah, he included Brandt and Ides' travel journal entries into his book. Of course, since he was such a well-known influential person, that book reached so many people, and all of a sudden everyone was reading about this shaman and his rites and what he looked like. He even included a picture of that shaman, so someone after the description of the travel journals by Ides and Brandt, someone drew a picture of that supposed shaman, and Witsen included that into his book. So now everyone had this image of the shaman, and with a very, very nice addition that Witsen described the shaman under the photo as a devil priest. And this picture of the supposed shaman, and I will try to find it and put it up on screen so that you can see it. It definitely depicts some kind of weird mixed animal human being. Looks very much supernatural, very strange. And that is very important because, of course, it said this is a priest of the devil, a devil priest. It included a lot of things that were back then attributed to the devil. For example, horns / antlers, and for example, very large ears that look like donkey ears. Things like that were usually seen as like demonic and things that belonged to the devil, and the shaman, this magical practitioner, was depicted as that. So he was kind of a mix between an animal, a human, but also a devil. Very strange. And yeah, remember, Witsen had never even been to Siberia himself, let alone met the Evenki people or a magical practitioner. So this all just relied on the travel journals of Ides and Brandt, and it shows. For example, the shaman is also depicted as having a very big beard, but the Evenki people didn't wear beards. And what that basically led to was that all of these European people that were now reading that book, because Witsen was such an influential, well-known person, those people read the book, read about this devil priest, and saw all of these devilish aspects of this shaman that were completely made up and had nothing to do with the actual magical practitioner. But this image completely validated this image of a devil worshipper and a devil priest for these European people. So now all of these European people who had never even met any of these people, no Evenki people, no Siberians, no shamans, they had never met any of those, they were now all thinking that these people in Siberia are worshipping the devil and they have these weird demonic devilish type beings that are their priests. So yeah, fun times. Now we have this established image of all Siberians being devil worshipping shamans in Europe. Great. But yeah, that's not where it ends, sadly, not at all. This is a long history. Next up came Russia's colonialization of Siberia, because that built on this devil worshipper image of the Siberian person. Russia really wanted to colonialize Siberia. That was a thing back then. Everyone wanted to colonialize other countries and other areas because, well, financial gain. Siberia had a lot of potential fur trade to offer, and furs were very valuable and expensive. So of course Russia really wanted to colonialize Siberia. It was totally normal back then to basically legitimize your colonialization through religious and racist means. So the already established image of the Siberian people as devil worshipping shamans came in very handy there. Basically, to control Siberia after it was already basically in control of the Russian Empire. Yeah, Siberia is a very, very big area, so they had to kind of keep it under control. And how do you do that? Well, of course, you convert them to Christianity. So that is what the Russian Empire did. They forced everyone to convert to Christianity under death threat. And of course, they had this wonderful devil worshipper image that they could build upon. So they could basically say, we have to colonialize them and convert them to Christianity because we have to civilize those devil worshippers. They are so evil. We have to give them the gift of Christianity and civilization. Of course, you can't only control such a big vast area by only forcing them into Christianity. You also have to kind of know the area and the people that live there. So of course the Russian Empire sent out a lot of researchers, ethnographers to kind of gain some knowledge, gather some knowledge about the area. But of course those researchers and those ethnographers and all of those people were all funded by the Russian Empire. So yeah, of course they wouldn't write anything sympathetic towards the Siberian people. Of course, they would write something that helps the Russian Empire in their colonialization plans. So sadly, they built even further on this image of the devil-worshipping shaman. And sadly, it didn't even end there, because a little bit further down the line came the Enlightenment. And with the Enlightenment, of course, people became more rational and Christianity had less of a hold on the people. But Russia still wanted those pelts from Siberia. So since they couldn't really draw on that image of the devil worshipper anymore, because that just became less important during the Enlightenment, they ended up painting the magical practitioners that were of course still all called shamans. They painted them all now as fraud, as scammers, as basically just being out to get your money and to trick you, basically. And of course, during the Enlightenment, that was very, very bad, because everyone was all about being rational thinkers, and being a fraud and being a scammer was very, very bad back then. So now the so-called shamans weren't devil worshippers anymore. Now they were scammers. And this image of the scammer again gave Russia a legitimate reason to basically go into Siberia and Europeanize them, because we have to bring all of our enlightened values to this area where they are so confused and they are scamming people and they are all frauds, and we have to bring our European values into Siberia in the name of the Enlightenment. That was now the legitimization to basically exploit Siberia for their pelts. Again, they had a great boogeyman with the scammer shaman. And what followed, sadly, was a lot of physical attacks. Shrines and tools were burned. They were publicly humiliated all the time. And why? Because the Russian Empire wanted to exploit Siberia. And the shaman was always the boogeyman. And did it end there? You guessed right, of course it didn't end there, because now comes the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union really, again, wanted to exploit Siberia. Not because of their furs and pelts anymore, but because Siberia, of course, has a lot of oil and gas resources. And what do you need oil and gas for? Exactly, industrialization. And the Soviet Union really wanted this industrialization. So they needed all of this oil and gas from Siberia. But again, you need some kind of reason to basically deport people from their lands and banish them. So what reason do we want to go by? The devil worshipper image isn't really established anymore, but the scammer image is still very prevalent. So what did the Soviet Union do? They antagonized the so-called shamans. They were always from now on called shamans. Of course, because of their religion in general, because yeah, religion is bad, but especially because now they were kind of antagonized as this enemy of the working class, similarly to kulaks, who were like kind of wealthy, rich farmer people. The shamans were now seen as enemies of the working class people because, of course, they were scammers and they wanted to, scam the working class people out of their money by using their religion, and religion was bad in general. So again, the shaman as the boogeyman, so that the Soviet Union could basically, and that is what they did, they asked for the banishment of all of these people. They asked for the banishment of all of these people from Siberia so that they could get their oil and gas. And that is actually what happened. The native people of Siberia were banished, they were deported, they were put into labor camps. They were, of course, attacked and humiliated all the time. And from the 1980s on, shamans were basically seen as extinct. So the Soviet Union really did their job. Yeah, where do we end here? Before we get into the next important history lesson, we managed to exploit Siberia by making their magical practitioners the boogeyman all the time because of different reasons. Because they are devil worshippers, because they are scammers, because they are an enemy to the working class, and we make those the boogeyman so that we can exploit Siberia for their resources and so that we can colonialize Siberia, and then we drive them to extinction. And now remember, like that was like multiple hundreds of years of history in which shamans and shamanism were dragged through the mud. But of course it doesn't end there. Basically now that shamanism in Siberia is extinct, we pull it back up in the West and start to idealize it and even idolize it. On one half of the world, the actual shamans are being driven to extinction, while in the West, all the Western New Age people pull up shamanism out of their asses and use it for themselves. But let's get into that and where that came from. While in the East, slowly but surely, shamans are brought to extinction, in the West, a very important figure writes about shamanism, and that is a figure that has never seen or met a shaman in his life. Of course, I'm talking about Mircea Eliade. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. You might know him because, well, he has written a lot of influential books. He's, by the way, he was a fascist. Did you know that? Nice. Mircea Eliade never met a shaman in his life, had never been to Siberia, had never met anyone there, but still he proceeded to write a book about shamanism. Well, if you could call it that, because since he never met a shaman in his life, he only pulled from previous material, which, as we have seen, is not a reliable resource at all. Let me just say one thing. Mircea Eliade did one good thing with his book, and that was that he basically was the first one to rehabilitate any indigenous magical practitioners. Back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, after like we have had a lot of advancement in the field of psychology in the West, shamans and other indigenous magical practitioners were usually seen as just being out of their minds, just having mental illnesses, just being crazy people. That was the usual view in the West of any indigenous magical practitioner. And there's this one good thing that Mircea Eliade did with his book is he rehabilitated those indigenous magical practitioners, because what he wrote was basically that shamans, which in his worldview exist everywhere in the entire world and all the time, not just in one culture and one specific time frame. No, he says shamanism exists in the entire world and all the time because it's a basic technique. And he says that shamans have a very effective access to the divinity that institutionalized religions just like Christianity have lost. So he basically gave some kudos to shamans and other indigenous practitioners. So that was good. But apart from that, he completely stripped shamanism, which is a very, very specific thing that belongs to just the Evenki tribe in Siberia. That's where that verb shaman comes from. But he basically made it seem like shamanism exists in the entire world, everywhere. It's just an ecstatic technique. And yeah, he basically stripped it of all cultural context, of the entire history around that word, because of course, while he worked off of these bad resources, he of course didn't mention any of the awful history of these terms. No, he didn't. But yeah, he was basically the first one to pull a definition for shamanism out of his ass, because I don't know where he got that from. He basically said it's just an ecstatic technique, and we can find that technique in any culture, everywhere. So he made it very, very available to everyone, especially in the people in the West, which was very, very handy because time-wise that coincided with a Western society that was more and more individualistic. It also coincided time-wise with the psychedelic hype, which in itself has an awful cultural appropriative history. If you're interested in that, just research the history of psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms. Research that history because it's awful. That all coexisted time-wise. That basically led to people in the West picking up shamanism as a technique for themselves to basically work on themselves, which is pretty funny because, as I said, Mircea Eliade stripped shamanism of all its cultural context, which of course it also stripped shamanism of its role as helping the community. Shamans usually didn't work on themselves through their techniques. They help the community for healing or other various things. Well, now it was picked up in the West, in the very individualistic West, as a technique to work on yourself. And bam, a lot of the New Age practice was born. And I mean, why not, right? Shamanism seemed very exotic, it's something new, it seems very, very authentic, individualistic, and very, very mysterious, but still, you can just grab it and take it, because Mircea Eliade wrote that it exists all over the world, so why not take it and make it yours? This technique of shamanism being picked up in the West is very ironic if you think of the fact that that time-wise coincided with the actual shamans in Siberia being brought to extinction. That happened at the same time. At the same time, in Siberia, those people were brought into labor camps and banished and deported and killed, while at the same time, their techniques were stripped off of the history, off of the cultural context, put into the West as a technique with which you can access the divine and work on yourself, and it was picked up and made into this huge hype. And of course, with all of this hype and it time-wise coinciding with the psychedelic hype, of course that brought people to the idea of like merging the use of psychedelics with this ecstatic technique, because the use of psychedelics promised the same thing, an ecstatic experience that gives you access to the divine. And shamanism as a technique promised you the same thing. So of course a lot of the times these two were merged, but the most important thing is that there was one person who was very, very influenced by Eliade's books and who started practicing these techniques and made his own experiences. And this person actually trained with a South American shaman, so there is that at least. People in Southern America didn't even call themselves shamans. He trained with a South American shaman, let's just say a South American indigenous practitioner. And yeah, this person became later the father of core shamanism, who is of course Michael Harner. A lot of you have probably at least heard of him because his books are so popular, especially in the kind of new agey sphere, but also a lot of the times in the witchcraft sphere. And what Harner writes is basically very similar to what Mircea Eliade wrote. It's basically that shamanisms, also a very interesting word, shamanisms are kind of a core practice that exists in every single culture, but they just have like cultural specificities. So at least the cultural context came back a tiny little bit, but it's still seen as like a core practice or core experience that every culture includes. It's completely removed from Siberia. So yeah, with all of this idolization by now a lot of people and a lot of authors, come a lot of problems. For example, the term shaman is pushed on indigenous practitioners that would never call themselves that. They are being idolized as having some access to the divine that other people don't have. So people start like digging deeper into these indigenous practices, starting to appropriate actual culturally specific practices and not just some kind of trance technique. And yeah, one core part of what like shamans were about, and that is working for your community with your techniques and your experiences, is completely removed because in neo-shamanism and core shamanism, that's just not a thing. Everyone can just pick up these techniques and work with them and do that to work on themselves and not for the community, which is such an integral part. And yeah, as I said, I think it's so sad but so ironic that at the same time in the West, these practices were now idealized and idolized, and actual indigenous practices were starting to be appropriated, and names were put on them that they would never call themselves, while in the East, the actual shamans were pushed to extinction. Nice work, humanity. And even more sad is that after the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of Siberian people wanted to reconnect with their history and their past and their own practices. The problem is though that now no actual practitioners were left because, as I said, by the 1980s it's usually said that they were extinct. So how do you want to reconnect with your actual cultural practices if all of the sources about it, anything, all the tools were burned and destroyed and the people were killed? Well, a lot of those people turned to neo-shamanism because that was the only way that they could in some way reconnect with it. Michael Harner had an organization that actually, after the fall of the Soviet Union, went to Siberia to help build their practices back up again, which is so ironic because core shamanism and neo-shamanism has basically nothing to do anymore with the original practice. It was so far removed. The whole principle of shamanism has been so far removed from the cultural context of Siberia that they basically brought a culturally stripped version of the original practices back to Siberia. How sad is that? So yeah, that is a quick overview of the history of the terms shamanism and shaman. By now you probably understand why it's very problematic and just plain awful. That is also why I don't really like using those terms anymore. But now I guess let me quickly summarize everything that's wrong with the terms shaman and shamanism and stuff. So first of all, shaman was originally a word that was used by one specific tribe of the native Siberian people for one type of their magical practices. Even just this one tribe had a lot of different words for different magical practitioners, but the West picked out one word and just ran with it. The image of the shaman was very quickly used to basically symbolize all Siberian native people. It wasn't only the devil worshipping priest, but everyone was quickly a devil worshipper or a scammer. And these images were continuously over hundreds and hundreds of years used to exploit and colonialize Siberia. Any research that was done about like shamanic practices and stuff in Siberia back then were done basically under those aspects. So they were done to further these ideologies and to basically support the colonialization and the exploitation of Siberia. So there are very, very, very few people who did actual proper research about these terms and about shamanism and stuff like that. Most of it was just bullshit that was used to further Russia's ideologies and Russia's colonialization. So you can basically summarize the history of the terms shaman and shamanism as the history of the oppression of Siberian people. But that wasn't enough, because after all of the colonialization, the exploitation, driving the shamans, the actual practitioners, into extinction, well, there came the fetishization, with its own very, very fair share of cultural appropriation of native practices in the West, that emerged from a completely altered image of what the practice was like and what the practice is, and that was completely stripped of its cultural background and its history. And in general, we have just a very, very big problem with shamanism research, because, well, the people back then, the native Siberian people, didn't write any shit down. And as I already said, there was little to no research on any of these terms or practices before the Russian Empire tried to colonialize Siberia. There were basically no independent people doing research on this topic. So it's very, very unreliable. So where do we go from here? Are we still allowed to practice shamanic practices? Are we allowed to call ourselves shamans? What do we do with all of this info? Basically, it comes down to I can't tell you, because there is no rules about it. So my goal with this video was just to give you the necessary background information so that you can decide for yourself. And the only thing that I can do now is to tell you what I'm doing with that information. I try not to use it anymore, because it's too far gone from its original meaning, because it was so much stripped of its cultural context and its history. And with all of the, like, first of all, colonialization, exploitation, extinction, and afterwards fetishization and cultural appropriation, I just don't feel comfortable using that term anymore, honestly. And whenever I do, because I know what people are talking about, I will just do air quotes, I don't know, because it's just, I know we don't really have another word for this technique that has emerged from like Mircea Eliade and Michael Harner and everyone like that. But it's, I don't know, with all of that history, should we really continue using that word? I doubt it. At least I have decided for myself that I do not feel comfortable using that term anymore, because it's just awful. But yeah, in the end, you just have to decide for yourself what you do with this information, because I'm not your mom. I'm not telling you what to do. I just give you the information. So with that being said, that's everything that I wanted to go through in this video. If you have any further info, then put them in the comments. Let's talk about it. I hope this video wasn't too depressing, because I know the history is just plain awful. So it's, I don't know, I need a little pickup after filming this video, honestly. Still, I want to get into a patron shoutout, because I will do that always. Thank you so much to Segregated Facial Hair, Kent, Kelly, Lisa, Brittany, Emerceline, Small Kata, Josh, Virginie, Joseph, Elinura, David, Christine, Rixie Business, Valo, Annalena, Bast, Kirby, Ashley, Erica, Elentia, Anna, Kristen, John, Phoenix, Anton, Jenny, Maggie, Misty, Amy, Colette, Timothy, Coffee, or the Honorary Gossip Squirrel, and last but definitely not least, Bjorn. Thank you so much for supporting me. As always, I hope, even though it was a little bit depressing, you still liked the video. If you did, make sure to subscribe and give a thumbs up and ring the bell down below so that you're notified whenever I upload a new video. Of course, you can check out all of my other socials and my web shop for ethically and sustainably sourced witchcraft and paganism tools. And in case you want to support me in another way, then you can check out my Patreon. And I will see you in the next video in a more lighthearted one. Bye!